So I've started the recording for today. I'll go ahead and collect these at the end of class. But again, I wanted to use this to help you as you're mapping out and thinking about this next week and working on the essay assignment and starting to map and plan out where to go from there. So just a few major reminders. So there are two things that you should be citing within your essay. First of all, you should be citing from the Wrench textbook. So a really easy way to do that is to go to the PDF on the front page of Canvas, that's the whole textbook, right? And just use that and plug in the information, like the author, the year, all of that stuff into Citation Maker or the formatting that you use for citing. And then the guide that I have there will hopefully be helpful for you in citing in APA, MLA, or Chicago. As a reminder, you should cite whether you're paraphrasing, saying something in your own words. So social penetration theory is blah, blah, blah. Even if it's not a direct quote, you should cite because it's an idea or concept that's not your own. And then also cite when you're doing a direct quotation. If you're questioning or having issues with citations, let me know, and I'm happy to let you know if you're on the right track or there are things that you need to do to fix that. Remember, I would much rather have a late essay than an essay that doesn't have citations, so please make sure to do that. Remember, there's 2 to 3 main points related to interpersonal communication that you should focus on. So for instance, maybe you're really interested in nonverbal communication, and really interested in listening, and choose to focus on those two. So it's about 4 pages, double-spaced total, plus a works cited list. Again, if you go a little bit over the 4 pages, like if you get more in the 5 or 8 page range or so, that's okay. But try to keep it at least at those 4 pages without like super long headings or changing the margins or doing that type of thing. I've done it myself, so I know a lot of the tricks there. My advice, if you're feeling like you're running out of things to talk about or fill the space, is to really focus as deep as you can on the show or the movie itself, right? So maybe there's particular quotes or passages. Yeah?
So 4 pages, does it need to be on the 4th page or a complete 4th page?
It should be a complete 4 page.
Okay.
So, right, 4 pages total.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of folks, you myself included, would consider something that like gets into the 4th page is like 3 1/4 pages or something like that. So, question. Yeah, I find that like when you're quoting like from dialogue in particular, it'll start to add up time and space into your paper. And so, if you're feeling like you need more time, it's probably, or you need more space to fill, it's probably because there's a lot of content that you can dig into in more detail. I find a lot of people struggle with the page limit if they are talking about the show or movie really generally and need to look a little bit more into the conversations, ideas, and so on. And remember, you can have up to 3 big body points. So maybe you're talking about listening, nonverbal communication, and social penetration theory. And all told, right, you could have each of those be around a page or so, and then with the intro and conclusion, that puts you at 4 pages. I will still look at rough drafts and outlines. Remember that the cutoff to turn those in is next Wednesday, so I can guarantee feedback to you if you turn it in by next Wednesday. If you turn it in after that, I will try to get feedback as soon as I can, but I can't guarantee that I can get it back to you in time. So I've actually had the chance to take a look at a few rough drafts that people have sent that are looking pretty good. A couple things that I noticed that I want to speak to generally about that I've noticed from the draft so far. First of all, your introduction does not need to be like a sweeping like introduction to interpersonal communication in general, right? So you don't need to cover everything like about interpersonal communication in the intro. Instead, you might have an intro that focuses on some of the key areas or issues that you're looking at within interpersonal communication. So you might say, surprisingly, nonverbal communication is a huge part of how we engage with each other. This is something that we'll be exploring in the film Twilight, right? So you could use that as a way to introduce it. So if you're struggling to come up with a big like introduction, it doesn't need to be an introduction of interpersonal communication as a whole. That'll hopefully make it a little easier for you. Another thing that I encourage is what I call the half a page rule for paragraphs. So generally, double-spaced, good paragraph is usually no longer than like half a page. If it's a whole lot longer than that, like if you have a paragraph that's a whole page long, typically you're starting to get into content material that can probably be broken up into another paragraph. So I think as kind of a general writing tip, I would encourage you to keep your paragraphs not super long and to break up your thoughts and ideas into another paragraph if you need to. And then another thing that I recommend is when you're including like direct quotes, I encourage you to have some type of like transition or introduction into the quotes. So sometimes it's sort of like you're reading sentence, and suddenly there's like a quote from the book. Nonverbal communication is XYZ. And think about it as you're kind of guiding the reader through. So for instance, you could say, this brings us to the idea of nonverbal communication, which, according to Wrench, is X, right? So you're introducing or bringing in the source in a way that more naturally fits within the sentence. So I recommend using those kind of transition clauses according to or as we can see through in order to help make the quotations you include flow a little bit more smoothly. Those are just some of the things that I like to focus on in terms of grammar, sentence structure. Obviously, depending on the class and what people look for, that's a little different. I just wanted to be transparent with you about some of the pet peeves that I have in terms of grammar, spelling, punctuation, and all of that. So, we had some really fun discussion leading, including some fun holograms last class. We also talked about the midterm. So there's a question that came up last class about transactional model, right? So I wanted to provide some additional context to answer since some multiple choice questions and one of the short essay questions was about the transactional model. Remember, it has all those different parts. So encoding, decoding through sender and receiver, feedback, noise, and so on. So I was really looking for, in that short essay response in particular, that you were integrating some of the elements such as noise and feedback and how they impact that process, right? Our communication isn't totally one person to another. There are things that are interfering or getting in the way or distorting our message, right? And I feel that too, it's Friday. So we've talked a little bit about citation. Again, this is a resource designed to help you out. I also want to go over some of the things that I kind of gleaned over from Monday and Wednesday, but to discuss some of these ideas in mediated communication in a little bit more detail. And I wanted to pose some questions that I'll have you all discuss in groups and then talk about together that I think are just kind of interesting ways of talking about mediated communication in a little bit more detail. So one of the ideas that I think is helpful when we're talking about mediated communication, and again, as you're thinking about how media might play into something like your final essay in the class, or even something like your interpersonal analysis essay for next week, right, are these ideas of psychosocial development, and in particular, what we see here between this 12 to 18 range and this 18 to 40 range. So a lot of folks, including Eric Erickson, in psychology and development, as we heard from our discussion group, right, there's this idea that we deal with these contradictions over the course of our lives. We'll talk more about contradictions in terms of friendships next week, but it's the idea that we want two different things or we're balancing between two different things at once, right? So trust versus mistrust, when we're like at a very young age and we're forming a bond or attachment to our parents. As we're developing the idea of initiative versus guilt, doing things on our own, versus getting a timeout for calling somebody a name or doing something that we shouldn't do. So we're constantly dealing with, as we grow up as people, these kinds of contradictions and questions in our lives. So in particular, in this kind of 12 to 18 range, we deal with identity and role confusion. And then from 18 to 40, it's said that we're dealing with things such as intimacy versus isolation. And these kinds of questions are in many ways directing us toward the use of media, because while it's listed as 12 to 18, identity development is something that we really play with throughout our lives, right? It's figuring out who the heck we are, what groups, in terms of friend groups, activities, and so on, do we use? What ways do we express ourselves and show who we are to other people, right? This is typically a time where, for instance, students who are LGBTQ plus start to come out to their families or realize, this is who I am. So there's a lot of ways that this kind of stage is really important. And through the use of a lot of things such as specialized Facebook groups or social media, right? There are a lot new opportunities for people to find like-minded folks and to explore those connections further. So it's something we always do, but something that particularly as teenagers becomes really, really important to us and something that media gets to help facilitate. And kind of as we develop, right, and a place that a lot of us are right now, we're dealing with this kind of contradiction of we want to be on our own, we want to be independent, we want to be our own people, right, and feel like we can achieve things that are important to us, but we also feel a need to connect meaningfully with other people. This generally is the age where a lot of our really close friendships or romantic relationships and so on really start to develop. So it's this sort of stage where we want to deal with our own independence while also feeling connection toward other people. So that's something that's really guiding us toward the use of Zoom and a lot of online platforms, especially over the last year and a half, right? So, and it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge to navigate some of those really deep feelings of isolation that we've had to deal with in this past span of time in particular. So Irving Goffman, who was referenced a little bit earlier this week, is a really major player when it comes to sociology and understanding our identity. One area that I looked at, especially with Goffman, was back in the 1950s, and he wrote a book about stigma and the role that stigma plays in our identity development and so on in life. I'm curious how many folks, either as a requirement for an English class or in general, have ever read or heard of the Scarlet Letter? Yeah, so several of you, right? So if you're not familiar, right, it's, I think it's Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's an older book where the main character is a young woman who commits adultery, and as punishment, right, she has to wear this gigantic letter A on her dress and go around with that letter A so that people see it and know, oh, you committed adultery, right? And that's sort of this major premise of the book, right? What Goffman thinks about when it comes to identity and the way that you present yourself is this idea of how we out or present parts of ourselves to others. So for instance, stigma goes all the way back to the Greek use of the word stigmata, this visible sense or marker of yourself as undesirable or unwanted. We think back to things like leprosy, right, which was of course very visible, very clearly marked. And the idea of stigma is that there's this visible indicator of who you are and how you're read or interpreted within society. It's a really interesting area within communication and a thing to explore in terms of how we express ourselves to other people. In fact, you might remember the extra credit opportunity where you were looking at an outside example of interpersonal communication. The late Dan Brower, B-R-O-U-W-E-R, actually has a really cool article that talks about how folks who are HIV positive, he was interviewing HIV positive folks who actually got tattoos on their wrists that said that they were HIV positive. And he was interviewing those folks in the context of their dating life and their romantic and sexual relationships. What does it mean when you are essentially stigmatizing yourself by saying, I'm HIV positive, and trying to create a conversation on the basis of making that part of your identity really clearly marked and visible to others? So that's one example of an outside article you could use for your extra credit, but I think a really good example of how we present ourselves to other people. So Gotham's really concerned with our front stage self, right? What we put out there and what we show to other people. Again, we've talked about this in terms of impression management and engaging with other people online, but it's a really important idea, this front stage version, and then the backstage, what's hidden within something like the Johari window. What are the parts of ourselves that other people don't see about us and the decisions that we make there, right? We've had a lot of discussions in the past several months nationally about issues of race, of identity, and so on. One of the key things here, right, is that there's a lot of question about the degree to which certain parts of self or identity are or are not visible. So, for instance, right, for a lot of folks, they might not necessarily have a lot of the same luxuries of hiding parts of themselves that they're not comfortable sharing backstage. So, for instance, if somebody has disabilities that are invisible or intermittently visible, right, there's both the kind of privilege and erasure that happens when it's backstage or it's not always visible or marked, right? Somebody who exclusively uses a wheelchair, that's very visible, that's seen all the time. And so one thing to think about here is that the front stage and backstage selves are not things that we always have a choice about in terms of whether or not those things are seen. And I think thinking about those differences is an important consideration in terms of media and identity. And in fact, one of the big draws of mediated communication is the idea that there's a lot more that you could choose not to share. So, if you're like doing something like 4chan, right? If you've been to that disaster of a website, right? It's an online forum where people are completely anonymous, and as you could probably imagine, it gets pretty bad. So there's a lot of different ways that people might not choose to share parts of themselves that they're otherwise forced to do face to face. On Wednesday, the discussion leading group brought up some of the ways that we present ourselves online, right? Either as a completely anonymous version, like all you are is something like a username. So when I was like a kid, my favorite video game character was Tails from Sonic the Hedgehog, so my username was SuperTails61, right? So I was just like this anonymous person with this username. A pseudonym, right? That's how you would pronounce that. It's a tricky one, right? A pseudonym is sort of a persona or version of your identity that you put online. So, for instance, a lot of authors will use pen names. So, the author J.K. Rowling, for instance, chose to use J.K. because she didn't want readers to know that she was a woman, because she thought that maybe her work would be less popular if they saw that it was written by a woman, right? And that was a very real concern that was impacting a lot of her decisions there. There's a lot more recent stuff we could talk about with her, but that's an example of using like a pseudonym or a pen name, and we use that online a lot, right? There's a lot of really interesting, I guess, questions and tensions about how you might choose to use a pseudonym or a version of your identity online that doesn't quite represent who you are. A lot of times people will create like an avatar character using an online game or something that is different in terms of gender, race, and so on. And so there's some interesting questions there about exploring your identity or trying on a different identity in that context. And then your real life identity is just like you, and depending on the mode of media that you use, that like real life self is going to look pretty different. So just some interesting considerations for us to think about in terms of how we choose to share who we are online with other people. So I briefly mentioned, I know the discussion group did a great job of talking about some of these theories. I just want to provide some additional context and ways of thinking about these. Again, these are theories that you could incorporate into your essay for next week, or also ones that you could think about as we're gearing up for the final assignment of the class. And these are all related to the ways that we use media to communicate with other people. Last night, my partner and I were sitting on the couch, and we wanted to watch a silly romantic comedy, but we had the classic problem that I think a lot of people run into, where they go on Netflix or something, and they just like, we saw all these options available, but there was nothing we wanted to see. Like, we're just like, no, not this one, no, not this one. And so we like spent a long time just looking at things, and then we just went to bed without watching anything at all, right? So one of the challenges, of course, is that we're presented with so many options now. Not only within Netflix alone, but the streaming wars in so many different areas to get that. You can obviously watch stuff for free on YouTube. There are so many ways that we are able to access media, and uses and gratification theory very much the idea that media is meant to serve us. If we think back to like the turn of the century and the invention of things like the newspaper, right? At that time, there was an assumption that essentially media controls society, because something like journalism, a newspaper headline, is able to frame essentially not only what is included or what we think about, but also how we think about it, what is or is not included in the frame. So for instance, the United States takes the offense on the war on terror. That's a headline that tells us, hey, the war on terror matters and is an important topic, but it also tells us the United States is on the offense, it's taking this like active approach and telling us how we should understand this conflict. So in the past, a lot of media theories sort of took the approach that media has this overwhelming influence on us, and it certainly does to some extent. But uses and gratifications theory takes the other position and says, no, we're the ones with control. Media, in many ways, is responding to us and our needs. One example of this is that a lot of publications have switched to paid subscriptions, like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and all of them, because those sources of media have gotten less popular. A lot of people are choosing, maybe they're using more social media, or maybe they're not checking the news as much, or maybe they're getting news from specific places. So that's another example of uses and gratification theory. It's the idea, go to a grocery store, you're picking out the food that you want for yourself. And in the same way, we use media to fulfill our needs, not the other way around. Social presence theory, as we talked a little bit about earlier, is the idea that the degree of presence, like or physical engagement that we have with others, plays a really big role in how rich or how meaningful a message is. So again, one of the challenges of really big Zoom rooms where there's these tons of little boxes, right, is that there's so much nonverbal communication that we can't see because of lighting, because of the size of the frame, and all of those things. There's a lot of physicality, like proxemics, the use of touch or haptics, that's getting missed in the equation, right? A lot of people on Zoom where you're like seeing their heads and they're like wearing pajamas, or they don't have their cameras on, or something like that. So social presence theory suggests the degree to which our media is visible and can be clearly seen by other people plays a really big role in our identities. Media richness theory. So I mentioned last class, noise canceling headphones. I use them all the time. They're a godsend when I'm needing time to focus. It's the idea that media can be more or less rich or meaningful or impactful for us based on the way that it's delivered and so on. So something like a text where it's asynchronous, you know, maybe you're like sliding into somebody's DMs and it's very like, it's back and forth, but it takes some time, right? That can be not as rich, but something where it's like, I don't know, virtual reality or something could be very rich by comparison. So the degree to which media has the potential to really engage with you is sort of measured here. And then I like the way the discussion group last class brought up social information processing theory, right? So one of the key ideas that social media processing theory says is that, you know, it can actually be more meaningful, or it can do more than a face-to-face encounter. And that's not something everybody agrees on, right? But hyper-personal communication is the idea that because your mediated communication can be really focused, can be really meaningful with that other person, it gets rid of some of the other external noise and stuff going on. that it can, really form that connection. Again, if you've ever seen the Joaquin Phoenix film Her, right, the entire premise of the film is the main character is forming this like emotional and romantic relationship with this artificial intelligence that's literally just a voice. The idea that he's constantly talking to her and having this conversation would be an example of hyper-personal communication in action. That wouldn't be available face-to-face because, one, she's not real, and two, because there wouldn't be the opportunity to constantly have that conversation happening. So social information processing theory suggests that there's a lot of these new ways that we're able to connect and have these kinds of relationships with other people. So I wanted to hit on some of those theories since I know I rushed through them a little bit last class and just wanted to give us some time to think about and understand them a little bit better and to build off of the key points that the discussion group brought up really well. So what I want us to do now is you can find maybe a group of like 3 to 5 people that are sitting near you. So say hello to your neighbors and chat a little bit. What I want to do is kind of pose some questions for you, give your group the chance to address those questions, and then we'll talk about these questions together. So the first question that I have that I'd like you to talk about with some other people near you is how the use of mediated technology has changed, in your opinion, the way that we communicate face-to-face. So I'll give you a little bit of time to chat about that, and then we'll talk about that together. Good interpersonal relationships, role that technology has in communication, and so on. So remember, continue to work on your essay. Next Wednesday's the last chance to turn in that rough draft or outline. And then I really appreciated our discussion and the points that folks brought up here about media. These are things we'll continue to look at next week as we start talking about friendships, relationships, and so on that we form with other people. So we have that for next week. And some new reading to get into for next Monday, too. Have a great weekend. Please pass forward your attendance stuff for today. Have a great weekend. If you're like me, you're going to spend the weekend playing the Switch because there's a new game that just came out that I'm super excited and have been waiting months for.
What are you playing this weekend?
I'm playing Shin Megami Tensei 5. I'm so excited.
Did the Diamond Control remakes come out?
Oh, yeah. I heard that those got leaked. I heard that there's like a leaked version or something. But, yeah.